resting underwater. Do you?
Whoa, too far.
That's also the frame. Do you want to give us a little bit of background just as to what this point was used for?
Well, yeah. In the original documentation, like one of the first clues is in the log of USS Avocet, which was the Navy seaplane tender that was based at Pongo Pongo. And so for the entries on January 11th, actually there's an entry at 5:30 that notes the departure of the PAA, Pan American Airways Clipper, on its way to Auckland, and then they they record that they've gotten news of the that the airplane is overdue, and they're starting to raise steam, and then at 19:10, it's set just after 7 in the evening. There's a notation that the ship is now en route from the Naval Station Wharf, Pongo Pongo, or departing Naval Station Wharf, Pongo Pongo, en route to a point 12 miles north of Tapu Tapu Point. So those were the instructions they had received from Lieutenant Williamson, from the commanding officer of the Avocet, and also the pilot of the search plane that they had employed. So Lieutenant Williamson had gotten airborne just a few hours after the loss of communication with Samoan Clipper, and investigated reports from people living on the north side of the island that they had spotted smoke to the northwest. And so he got airborne within just a few hours, and flew out here and had spotted oil and debris floating on the surface of the water. So figured he was a naval aviator, trained to find and report targets at sea, and it was his estimation that what he was seeing was just 12 miles north of Tapu Tapu Point. And we have felt like we must be close. I mean, this is this kind of situation is you can have a lot more confidence in the navigation, in that if the ship or a plane has been at sea for a long time, especially like if a ship's been at sea for a week or more, and the crew is navigating by the stars and by dead reckoning, a lot of error can creep in. But in this instance, the searchers would have the reference of the island. They can see the landmarks clearly, as you can on the camera right now. So you can pick out the very western tip of the island is very distinctive right there, Tapu Tapu Point. So he has a reference mark, and could see, certainly in the air, you can see the oil slick and the island at the same time. I mean, we're having no trouble at all seeing it, from the surface of the ocean as well. So, he could double check that figure. It's not even just, it doesn't have to be just an estimate, just eyeballing it. He could, orbit the plane above the oil slick, and then on his return to the base at Pongo Pongo, just line up the nose of his airplane on that tip, and take a look at his compass heading, which would be due south, and take a look at his watch. Note the time when he starts in that direction, and then as he flies over Tapu Tapu Point, check it again. And then it's just a simple matter of calculating that his speed should have been, the cruising speed for a Grumman duck is 155 miles per hour. So, and if, say, he had taken about 4 minutes and 40 seconds to reach that point of land, he knows he was really 12 miles offshore. So that was kind of a critical navigating point for everything that led up to this. The Avocet, as it makes its way to the search area, constantly references, coming, sighting Tapu Tapu to starboard, and then adjusting their course and cutting across until they are lining up their stern, just as ours is right now, and pointing it back towards that point of land, and then just worked their way back and forth through the night, going north and south, lining up either their bow or their stern on that point, waiting for the sun to come up, which it did about a little past 6 in the morning, and they were right there. They, within 2 minutes, they recorded having sighted the oil slick. So, this is the spot. We are close. We know it has to be here, nearby, and it's just a question of continuing the scan, which we will, and hopefully before our clock runs out, we will have found the wreck. But it's here. It's here somewhere,
Yeah,
very close.
and as we've been talking about all of these different locations and these landmarks, and where the Avocet was, and where we believe the Samoan Clipper went down, it's been a very surreal experience to, you know, I've spent the last few months reading about it. You've spent the last few years researching it, and to now be here and see it all, come to fruition is a very surreal experience. One of perhaps the wildest moments was when we were at port in Pongo Pongo Harbor and looking over that ridge and looking at that photo of the Samoan Clipper as it was diving, to land over the ridge, and we could see it virtually unchanged even 81 years later, and to see the sort of conditions and the way in which they would land is pretty phenomenal. And maybe, Miles, if you don't mind, we could look at the harbor again on HPAC or HIPAC and put it back.
Yeah, that was a surreal moment for me too when we boarded Nautilus and could go up on the bow and see it was pointed right towards that ridge of land. So on the map, you can see Pongo Pongo Harbor and the entryway, the entrance to the harbor on the south shore, and you come in and it makes that right angle, and there's that narrow that narrow stretch that moves towards the west, and where the words Pongo Pongo are written there is the further extreme edge of that inner harbor, which as a result of it being so sheltered is extraordinarily calm, but presents a real challenge for aviators, even with Music's great skill and experience to approach and land there in a seaplane. The ridge line on that western end is 800 feet high, and the mountains around it tower as high as 1,700 feet. And so Samoan Clipper would have to approach there, from the west, and then crest that ridge, and then just dive immediately for the water in order to have enough of a run out area in the calm water to land and get the plane stopped. And so it was amazing after all the kind of dreaming and planning and research to stand on the deck of Nautilus and see that ridgeline and relate it to that very dramatic, historic photograph, and other pictures of the plane, just skimming the surface of the water there, or taxiing back to its base at the Pan Am dock, and to just have Nautilus suddenly there, almost as if by magic, though there was nothing sudden about it at all. This was the result of a lot of very careful and deliberate planning by a lot of people over the course of many months and years to make this possible.
And then, of course, the location that we're in right now is based upon a variety of things that your team has been researching, the Bureau of Air Commerce investigation report, as well as Navy logs from the investigating ship at the time. There was also an aircraft that flew over to find, at the time, the debris field. And then, of course, there is the eyewitness. And a lot of our viewers have been wondering, how do we know that this person did in fact see the wings, and especially from the distance perhaps
Right.
that they were away from the
Yeah,
crash site?
yeah. I mean that bit is a bit of a puzzlement. Her testimony was judged extremely reliable, at the time, in that she gave her account to the head of her village before word of the missing aircraft had reached them. So it's extraordinary that she had this story to tell and in such detail, and where so many pieces of this story match up with what is known about the circumstances of the loss of Simone Clipper. So in her account, she was in her boat, just having left Fangasa Bay, headed for Asu, and Fangasa is just the other side of the ridge from Pongo Pongo, facing north, and Asu is west down the coast. And she doesn't give an account of exactly how far offshore she was. I mean, I assume if she's just transiting, she's not going to go very far out to sea. But there's another account saying that supposedly she was fishing, so that might prompt you to go further from shore. But in any case, she reported seeing the airplane approach, that it turned and it flew overhead, a low overhead, across the mouth of Fangasa Bay, going east to west, headed in the direction of Apia, which is west of here. That after it passed over and she saw what she took to be smoke trailing from the wings, but after the plane had passed over, there was the smell of gasoline in the air. And we know that the airplane reported they were preparing to dump fuel in order to lose excess weight before attempting that very challenging landing at Pongo Pongo. So that detail, matches exactly with what we know was in the plane was in process, what the crew were doing at that time. Then she describes the plane as making a wide turn out to sea and proceeding away from her, basically towards the north until it dives for the water, and there's a flash and a sound of a detonation and a great deal of smoke, and then she talks about the wings of the planes floating at the surface before it sinks from sight after about 5 minutes. And that part of it is a bit puzzling, because if she's in a boat, she's essentially at sea level, or maybe what, 5 feet above sea level if she's standing in it, and so the line of sight to an aircraft, even when floating on the surface, it's a little hard to reconcile that. Like, how could she see that level of detail? But again, like, there's some unknowns there. Like, really, how far was she from shore? When she describes the plane, the wings floating at the surface, does that mean that they were floating flush with the surface, or the aircraft, when it was intact, that wing is about 15 feet from the water. So is the plane, partially still intact with the wings raised up above the surface that gives her a better view? Another thought is it actually the tail of the plane sticking up into the air with it, with the front half of it sunk, and she's really seeing the horizontal tail and interpreting that as wings, which they have the same kind of appearance, especially from a distance. So
that's interesting.
yeah, so we just can't really know, but so much of her story, rings true with what we know of the circumstances and what had happened, and the fact that she told that story before anybody knew that anything had happened. I can't understand, like, how and why she would have made up something like that, and for it to jive so well with what we know of the circumstances and what was happening. So I think there's just some pieces that perhaps once the wreck is pinpointed, we'll have a much better idea of how they all fit together and what the most likely scenario is that explains, like, all that she saw.
Right. It seems like we, overall trust what she saw. We just don't know exactly what that was. And unfortunately, the investigation report, I think, is maybe a little bit vague in describing what it is that what her statement was.
Well, I mean, they transcribe her statement with a fair degree of interpretation as well. I mean, things like the fact that, and they do provide in a lot of instances what her original statement was, but then it also is kind of being being you know, interpreted, and maybe not literally, maybe not, but also just you know, evaluated, and trying to explain, like explanations, like the thing about, you know, her seeing smoke trailing from the wings of the plane, and this the supposition is actually that that's fuel vapor, like trailing behind, that the plane is not actually burning at that point, because it isn't until, you know, they turn out to sea that the plane suddenly, you know, makes the dive for the water. Yeah, and I mean, there's varying accounts. I mean, there's the account as it's written up, you know, as the investigators, you know, choose the pieces of it that they find most relevant and provide that, and then there's, you know, more expanded versions in the radio traffic, as executives at back in San Francisco are requesting additional information, and then the station manager here, Conley, is replying to them with you know, with what you know, what he's learned from the witness, and you know, in some cases they provide what seems to be her words, you know, saying that there was a sound like a gunshot, which is presumably the you know, the fuel detonating. So he doesn't say it's a, you know, she heard a fuel explosion. He says she heard a noise like a gunshot, you know, things like that. So you know, but there's a bit of interpretation that goes back and forth, and a bit of, like, you know, that in the absence of being able to ask the follow-up questions ourselves, there's certain pieces that we can't know, and we have to kind of make our best, you know, guesses as to how they all fit together.
And I'm double checking just to be sure, but I believe the accident report investigation is available online.
Yeah, I know. I know. I know now that the original Bureau of Air Commerce accident report, dated 1st of April 1938, is now linked to the Wikipedia page on the loss of Samoan Clipper. It wasn't 5 years ago,
Right.
when we started researching it, and Lonnie chased that report through 4 or 5 different archives before finding it in the files of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. But yes, now you can look it up online, and it's about 13 pages and gives a lot of great detail. And I spoke to one of our scientists ashore, is a retired accident and investigator, aircraft accident investigator for Boeing. Spent 35 years, you know, investigating exactly these kinds of things, and he told me he was actually quite impressed with the level of detail and the work that they did, you know, even that long ago, that he saw real kinship with them, and the process that they went through, and the deductions that they were making, and so yeah, so it's fascinating reading. If you're really interested in the subject, I encourage you to go and go back to the primary source material on the account of the loss of Samoan Clipper.
Yeah, and by doing so, I read through it, and you can, you know, see all of those references that Russ has been giving in such great detail in real time. So I definitely encourage those of you who, you know, kind of have your own theories and want to pursue your own investigation, check out that accident report. It is on the Wikipedia page if you just do a quick search of Samoan Clipper. And there's also just 2 quick paragraphs about the Samoan Clipper. So if you want to find out a little bit more, go into more detail, you can check out the recent blog post on nautiluslive.org to see some photos as well as newspaper clippings. And then, of course, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, there are some additional links to the Pan Am Historical Foundation, as well as some blog updates that Russ has been providing. And those also have a lot of detail, including that image that we just talked about of the Samoan Clipper sort of diving over that ridge into Pongo Pongo Harbor. There are also, again, a lot of newspaper clippings, photos of the Samoan Clipper and other S-42s, and pretty much all of the information that you may want for now, and at least enough to give you a baseline of future research. this is a good question that actually I haven't seen at least come up on our watch. Has your team thought about the combustion temperature of fuel and the melting point of aluminum, and maybe how that might have played into any sort of debris?
No, not really to that level of detail. I mean, I did, try to consult with a, I did consult with a, scientist that Dr. Delgado has worked with, and we were trying to come up with some sort of figure for really just kind of the power of the explosion, and there's a lot of variables there that we don't have. I mean, it has to do with like the temperature and the sort of the like the dew point and the volume of the tank, and whether or not like was the tank, how full was it, the ratio of liquid fuel to fuel vapor, and the construction of the vessel itself that was holding the fuel. So there's a lot we just don't know, and so there were too many variables to really come up with an approximate like figure on just how powerful it was. As far as like the melting point and so forth, no, presumably there was there was the explosion. I mean, I know the accident report talks about some of the items recovered, the experts who had studied them, realized that some pieces had been wetted first and then set on fire, as if like they'd been splashed with fuel. So maybe that argues for a fuel vapor explosion in the compartment that ruptured the tank, and then released fuel, and then that caught fire. And but yeah, whether or not it would have had a chance, how much time was there between when the detonation occurred, when the accident happened, and before the plane is in the water. I mean, it was reported at very low altitude. And low speed, so it presumably was into the water very very quickly, after the explosion took place. But there was also talk of seeing a great quantity of dark black smoke, and so if the fuel is floating on the surface, is it on fire, and is the like are any portions of the airplane in contact with it at the surface? So yeah, I don't. That's a really good question. I don't know that we'd considered it on that level. Just sort of knowing that, well, the plane was brought down by a fire and an explosion, but how exactly that process happened, and what damage, just how it compromised the Clipper in terms of its flying ability and the survivability of the crew, and then really its long-term survival of the historic remains as it lays on the ocean floor. We know that some of the aircraft that were discovered on the USS Lexington wreck site in March of 2018 by research vessel Petrel, that some of them were in phenomenal condition. The torpedo bombers from Squadron VT2, the Devastators were there were 7 of them that were in almost pristine condition, that looked like they'd been deposited there almost the day before. And we know those were spotted fairly far aft on the deck of the ship. But some of the dive bombers, the Dauntlesses, that were presumably much closer to the fires that were raging on Lexington and the explosions, and that may have compromised the structural integrity of the aluminum before it was submerged. Those show a high degree of degradation, where the kind of the center sections of those planes are virtually disappeared, and you only have kind of like the outer portions of the wings and some of the tail, and you know, this is a good question probably to pose to Megan when she's back on watch, because you know she is a materials conservation specialist and knows quite a lot about the makeup of you know aircraft structures, and especially you know submerged aircraft structures. So definitely maybe let's make a note of that question, and we'll bring it up again when she's on watch.
Yeah, good thinking. We do know that there was some debris that washed to the northeast. Sorry if I'm getting those coordinates wrong. After the fact, right? And so that of the coordinates where we were given,
Well,
that we know that the Samoan Clipper was at.
yeah, that's a bit of a deduction. I mean, the Avocet, you know, during the course of their search, you know, nowhere in those log entries do they ever actually record a position, not even a noon sight, and it's you know, to the researcher it's a little bit maddening, because they repeatedly use the phrase various speeds and courses. So you don't really know exactly where the ship is going at any one time once they reach the scene of the accident. But the major clue we can take is that when they note that the search has been called off, they set course basically south-southwest, and set their speed at 10 knots and just steam on that same course for about 4 hours, and then you know make note of again of Tapu Tapu Point being just on their port beam, and then they make the turn to go around the island. So we know to get back home, they had to steam to the southwest, and they did it for, you know, about 40 miles. And if you subtract the 10 miles that it takes to get to the suspected, you know, crash scene, then they had worked their way about 30 miles northeast, you know, presumably following the oil and the debris as it drifted with the wind and waves. So so we know that, and then the only other instance that we know of debris being found that was definitively from Samoan Clipper, and they do make note of the fact that they're going to continue searching the shoreline for wreckage. They're going to talk to and search for more witnesses, but the only follow-up, at least that's in the record, is an instance where they say 2 aluminum doors drifted ashore on the beach at Ofu, which is directly east of here, about 80 miles from the crash scene, the reported crash scene, and they later deduced that those were the doors to the ice box in the galley on Samoan Clipper.
Oh wow, I feel like that's a long way to drift, almost 80 miles.
Yeah, but it was found, or at least they sent them back about 11 days after the accident. The radiogram is dated 22 January, so it's 11 days later, and
Right.
and presumably they'd only washed up within the previous few days. So it's a week of drifting, and I think I did some sort of back of the envelope calculations, and it really would have only taken a drift of about 1 knot for it to cover that distance over a week. So
I see.
yeah, but we just take that bit of evidence that, like, okay, well, here's the one bit of like really empirical evidence that we have available to us, and it says that wreckage from Samoan Clipper went east, and so that's again part of the reasoning of why when we expanded our search area we decided to go to the west, because if we think that wreckage from the plane was being pushed east, then to track it back to where it came from, we need to go to the west.
And we still don't really know. We have ideas, but we don't know necessarily exactly what it was that prompted this explosion that the eyewitness describes.
No, there's a lot of theories that were advanced, but the accident report has to kind of reluctantly conclude that the cause was a a fire and explosion of undetermined origin. Um, and there's a lot of speculation, and at the time, most of the suspicion fell on the hot exhaust of the engines, where they were in the process of dumping fuel, and the fuel valves themselves were flush with the underside of the wing, and just where you would pull a lever and a spring-loaded valve would open and just allow the fuel in the tank to drain by gravity and just drain out the underside of the wing. But they noted an unfortunate tendency when that action was taken, that the airflow over the wing would generate these vortices that would sometimes redirect the fuel back into the wing, back forward, and in some instances back into the cabin of the airplane. There was a flight where they were on their way back from Honolulu, and I believe it was a flight that Music was in command in a different S-42, but they were on their way back from Hawaii to California, had an engine go out and shut that one down, and opted to dump fuel, and it started pouring in on the navigator's table inside the cabin, and the co-pilot quickly cut the master switch to all of the electrical components in the aircraft, save for the the ignition in the engines, and then they opened every window and hatch that they could to vent the vapors from inside the airplane. But yeah, so there was a real suspicion that fell on that somehow the fuel had flowed forward, and perhaps the hot exhaust from the engine had ignited it, and it spread that way, like through inside the wing and down into the airplane itself. Or perhaps in the same scenario, a spark from the electric flap actuators perhaps touched off the fuel, but that seems a bit less likely, in that they probably wouldn't have deployed the flaps until just before making the landing. Some kind of perhaps some kind of a static charge. Doesn't seem like it was the radio, because they had specifically shut that down to avoid exactly this sort of risk. The only other thing that has caught my attention was that knowing that the airplane was in the process of dumping fuel, and studying a diagram that was found at the Sikorsky Historical Archives by one of their researchers there, John Bulakowski. And then the head archivist, Dan Libertino, sent us a really pristine hard copy of this, where it's a large-scale drawing of the fuel system specific to the S-42B and the modifications that they made. And you can see where it had the 6 225-gallon fuel tanks mounted inside the airplane, where they stripped out the passenger accommodation in the compartment D, directly beneath the wing, and set up these extra fuel tanks to increase the range. But there is no provision made to drain those tanks directly, so you have to tap into the system that existed in the standard configuration of the airplane, which means that all the fuel tanks on that were mounted in the wing. And so in order to dump the fuel that's inside the hull of the plane, you first have to pump it up to the wing tanks and then drain it overboard. So there was a fuel pump for that purpose, and it was located directly beneath the flooring and the catwalk in that compartment, in that auxiliary fuel compartment. And it's interesting to note that the accident report talks about the idea of the fire originating under the flooring of the auxiliary fuel compartment, and again, studying that drawing shows that the fuel pump actually had two settings. There was a manual capability, and then it also an electric fuel pump. And so I just have to wonder if perhaps because we know the plane was in the process of dumping fuel, they would have had to pump the fuel out of those tanks, and that there was an electric fuel pump directly beneath the flooring where the fire is presumed to have originated. Might be just too much of a coincidence. And it's easy to imagine that just even a small leak developing in those internal tanks as the plane, as a result of like just the repeated shock of landings and takeoffs, even a small leak just starts to accumulate in the under the flooring in the what amounts to the bilge of this flying boat, and so even a small amount of liquid fuel sloshing around underneath the flooring, and more importantly the vapor, the fuel vapor, the very highly volatile like fuel vapor trapped under the flooring, and just one spark from a unshielded electric motor, and that could spell disaster. So that's another right now for the moment just a theory until we can find more clues, more evidence.
Right, and those are all clues that we could also get if and when we get eyes on the Samoan Clipper. So by getting a closer look at sort of how the state of the aircraft is and what characteristics it has, would help us to sort of clue in those missing pieces. For those of you that are just joining us, we are still off the coast of American Samoa in search of the Samoan Clipper. We're about 12 miles away from shore. We just a few moments ago had a quick view of Tapu Tapu Point, which is sort of a landmark location in this search for the Samoan Clipper. We are just wrapping up line 29. So yesterday we finished up that additional western area that we added to the initial survey area. We then tracked over line 11 to fill in a little gap that we noticed in coverage. And then earlier this morning, we got eyes on targets 30 and 31. So those were two of the more promising targets. We brought Argus over to get a visual, and they were unfortunately geological features. So we are continuing to expand upon the initial survey area to continue conducting the side scan sonar survey. So you can see in Argus cam, it looks like we are in sort of a flat, muddy area, and that is confirmed by the side scan sonar data that we're seeing. So that sort of rusty color, right, with without any bright yellow hot spots or sort of darker shadows surrounding them, is pretty indicative that there aren't any tall features along the seafloor, but rather we're coasting along, looking for those sort of anomalies. And as Dee Dee mentioned previously, this is sort of an ideal environmental condition that kind of helps us to pick out those points in side scan sonar. So it really allows us to see differences in height, and as well as those shadows. One thing that has come up a few different times in these discussions is sort of studying how the plane may have gone down and how it would have eventually reached the bottom of the ocean. So there is this working theory that the wing, it is the largest part of the aircraft, and it's also the strongest. It measures 118 feet in length, and then it was also connected to 4 half-ton engines. So that is sort of this bigger target that we've been looking for, this long aluminum structured wing with those 4 big engines. Are there, is there any sort of working theory as to perhaps if the wing or if the wing in the aircraft would have glided on its way down to the bottom of the ocean, would it have maybe, sort of flown as an aircraft does in the air?
Yeah, we've discussed that one here before. Did sounded like somebody wanted to offer a observation on
just
that.
I'm no
Ed,
aeronautical engineer, but aircrafts work due to thrust and airflow, and without anything to propel them forward in the water column, the weight of those engines is going to be the dominant factor in where it goes, I think. got 2 tons of engine, you're going down. I don't think there's a lot of glide going on. Of course, you could have had a separation of engines on some catastrophic landing, and then you have a viable wing. If the Samoan Clipper was a glider, maybe, but I would be surprised to find it 9 miles from here, or anywhere more than 500 meters from where it actually went underwater.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that its characteristics as an airplane were compromised, right at the point of the explosion. So we don't expect that it was an intact plane. And I mean, just the wing by itself, would not fly. As Ed noted, even in an intact airplane, you require thrust, to generate lift, and also, through the action of the airflow over the airfoil surfaces of the wings. So you're not, I don't think, generating that kind of pressure differential that's going to create lift through the water. The feeling is that it's probably flying about as well as an elevator with the cable cut. So,
yeah, my brother, when he was teaching Apache pilots, would tell them that a helicopter without a functioning rotor has all the aerodynamics of a grand piano. So,
yeah,
but viable theory.
right.
The frustrating thing is there's no doubt that if you walked out of this control van and surveyed the water around us, you're looking at where the aircraft is. And it's within sight.
Yeah.
If we could just drain the ocean or a portion of it.
Yeah.
Or stumble upon it here.
Well, if we happen upon it, it won't be by stumbling. It'll been the result of some really methodical and
yeah, that's very
tedious and careful, tenacious work.
Russ, how much would you? I know we're looking to just visually examine what we find and make a visual record of it, but boy, how informative would it be to get that engine number 4? And be able to get it in a hangar and have a qualified mechanical team give it a once-over.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly it was in the original research design that one of our goals is to get at least to get a look at that engine and see, what can we tell, at this stage,
and like
what happened.
Almost all accident investigations, doesn't matter if it's trains, driving, aviation, scuba, most incidents are the result of a cascade of smaller incidents.
Exactly.
And so if you trace it back to that oil leak and then follow that trail of events, you would really have the complete picture and provide an answer for the ages of what happened here.
Right. Just how did those dominoes fall? Like what series? How did that sequence unfold that where the pieces all fell into place to cause this tragedy? It's a lot of circumstances had to align, really the wrong way, to work against them.
Russ, you also spoke about, one of the theories. I think, I'm not sure if this is in the accident report or sort of, an after theory, but this notion of maybe static electricity sparking any sort of gasoline leak, and is that still something that's maybe in consideration into how this event unfolded?
Yeah, certainly it is. You know, I don't know enough probably about the physics of exactly, you know, how that might be generated, or what, you know, where the risk is greatest. But yeah, that certainly was you know, was one of the theories, and you know, could still be just as viable now. I mean, because, you know, gasoline vapor is extremely volatile, and it would only take the slightest spark to set it off. And if, you know, as we've heard these, you know, the story of this other incident, which actually John Hill, you know, included in his book Pan Am at War, mentions this this incident where you know, liquid fuel was actually pouring into the interior of the airplane. So that would be an extremely dangerous situation, and yeah, so even just the slightest inadvertent spark, you know, could have been the cause of disaster.
And obviously, this is long before JP4. Are they using gasoline or av fuel, or?
I think they're using 87 octane.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we know that Music had turned off radio transmission as well, sort of as a precaution when they were dumping fuel.
Yes, Tom Finley, the radio operator, when he signed off, you know, mentioned that he was shutting down the set, you know, in order to lessen the risk of exactly this sort of thing.
You know, turning that back on has its own risk, because that was probably a tube-based transmission system.
Right. Yeah, I know it was. You know, it was not voice transmission. It's all radio telegraphy. Yeah.
But those tubes are a heat source.
Certainly.
This is sort of a hard question, you know, especially because we don't know exactly what happened, and we trust that Music and his crew, you know, acted to the best of their abilities. But in hindsight, I mean, is there something maybe that could have been done that would have avoided this? You know, perhaps landing without dumping fuel, or maybe taking an earlier landing, if that was even possible, you know, given the weight of the aircraft.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's fair to look and examine the actions of the crew, and you know, because oftentimes the source of accidents like this is attributed to pilot error. But the investigators at the time did not conclude that. No one, you know, the crew of Simone Clipper was held entirely blameless in the aftermath, and I mean, all of it came with risk. So you know, and it's easy to think that, well, I mean, they were killed, so they obviously made the wrong choice. So they took the risk, you know, the higher risk. But no, I mean, the land, you know, to land the airplane, you know, with reduced power now, and so heavily overloaded, was fraught with danger, and you know, it would be less maneuverable, you know, more vulnerable to the stresses involved, and you never wanted to, if you could at all help it, land. Even though we talk about that, oh, this, you know, flying boats are safer because, you know, crossing over water, because you can land anywhere, but to land in a heavy sea in any kind of swell was extremely dangerous as well. I mean, you know, you catch the wrong wave on like a wingtip float, or you hit you know, misjudge your height, or you hit against the side of a swell, and you can just cartwheel the whole airplane, and this heavily loaded airplane would be very unwieldy and unmanageable. And you know, there were 10 Sikorsky S-42s built, and I think 5 of them were lost to accident, and I believe nearly all the others were landing accidents, and in areas, you know, where even just a miscalculation on in a normal landing area, you know, even in calm days, could spell disaster. So I think, you know, Music really weighed the risks ahead of him, and he knew how difficult that landing was in the calm water of the harbor, you know, in an airplane that was perfectly, you know, functioning the way it's supposed to, and nearly, you know, nearly empty of fuel. And so he knew better than anyone, having made that landing 5 times already, how difficult it would be with the with a crippled plane, you know, at that time, and you know, certainly had plenty of opportunity at landing at sea, and knowing how the dangers involved there. You know, and I've seen a photograph. I actually saw like a photograph of. So there was another Sikorsky aircraft, the S-43, which was a twin-engine design and sometimes referred to as the baby clipper, that had a lot of design features that were kind of similar to the S-42 and Simone Clipper, but just kind of scaled down, where it had the same engines but just 2 of them on a high wing, and you actually like boarded the plane through a hatch in the top of the fuselage in the back, and it was used kind of in sort of coastal routes and short haul routes. But I had a chance to study one of the survivors. There's 3 of them still preserved, and one of them is in a private collection of a man named Kermit Weeks at the Fantasy of Flight collection in Florida. And he very kindly took me back into the storage area and let me look over the airplane. And he had a picture of it that was taken when it was actually owned by Howard Hughes, and Hughes had been training with it to master flying boats in preparation for you know, attempting to fly the H-1 Hercules or the Spruce Goose. But they were practicing just on, I believe it was on Lake Mead, so in a very like calm inland lake, and just misjudged it for a second, and there's pictures of the airplane like after it was recovered and, you know, brought to shore, and the whole upper wing surface had detached and buried itself into the cockpit section. I mean, it was a miracle that Hughes and his co-pilot survived, and so I can't really second guess, you know, Ed Music's choice, you know, not to risk setting down either, you know, in the open sea or to try and you know, make it into that tight confined harbor with his plane, you know, now, you know, underpowered and so overloaded.
Russ, I can't help but wonder if their previous success and the expectations didn't work against them. That is, that this was an aircraft that they had put a lot of miles on. It was new. They trusted it. Everything had every problem he's had to solve in the past worked out well as the expectation that they had precious cargo and it was treated like gold. It was super important to develop this route, because you think that if this had been a acceptance flight or the second flight of this aircraft and they had this situation, that he may not have opted to, instead of trying to dump fuel, but chuck that mail out and put it down right away.
Right. Yeah. You know, certainly, not sure, you know, because I'm not sure how much difference the 751 pounds of mail would have made versus the, you know, 2,000 gallons of gasoline.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, I think he was going to have to dump some fuel no matter what. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you that you know, and I'm sure that Music like would have made that choice. Maybe made that choice every time if it meant, you know, the lives of his crew as opposed to.
If he knew that.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Yeah, if he knew that, yes, if he knew that the danger was as great as it really, you know, really turned out to be.
If the operating handbook said never dump fuel with the engines on.
Right.
You know, there go the seats.
But it really didn't. Actually, in the procedure,
mechanics are flipping a coin.
The procedure was to dump fuel, except not on passenger aircraft. They actually did not. They were forbidden to do it with that. So they may have felt, you know, the ability to take a bit more of a risk with the fact that they were all professionals, but also because they were hauling a great deal more fuel than the passenger planes would have.
And ultimately, this route and these aircrafts were meant to be passenger aircrafts, right? I mean, this was establishing. It was the inaugural mail route from Alameda in the Bay Area of California to Auckland, New Zealand. But the goal was to eventually have trans-Pacific air travel.
Yeah, yeah, passenger travel, sure. But yeah, the interesting thing is the S-42 was initially conceived of to make the Atlantic crossing, which didn't involve quite the same distances and where you have a lot more kind of options to you, that you're navigating to greater land masses and so forth, and crossing shorter distances. So in order to cover the greater ranges required, like they were using this modified airplane with the extra fuel tanks, but the passenger routes, the long passenger routes in the Pacific were handled by the Martin M130s, and then later by the even bigger designs that were then in development by Boeing, the Boeing 314, or sometimes called the Super Clipper, that had greater capacity, could haul more passengers, and had greater range, and lifting, could carry more cargo as well, and so the ultimate route was not intended that when they were going to start flying passengers to New Zealand and beyond, like they were not intending to use S-42s. They were going to use the 314s. So and they were not going to call it at Kingman Reef or Pongo Pongo even. They were going to go to Canton Island in what's now Kiribati, and on down, and kind of cut out those really more risky spots on the map. So yeah, and there was certainly a component of probably, as Ed was saying, that confidence in what they had accomplished in the past, and that Music could handle it, that he was something of a miracle worker, and could make it work, and there was an impetus to get this done now, because they needed to claim that valuable airmail contract to haul cargo and airmail between the United States and New Zealand, which really is what made it viable as a revenue generating run. Without those subsidies, there just wasn't the capacity to haul enough people yet to make the passenger trade pay, but which it ultimately would. It would, with the advent of the 314s and the airplanes that followed after.
And do we know, I mean, obviously with a passenger crew, they were forbidden from dumping fuel in the case of an emergency like
Yes.
this. Do we know of other instances where this crew, or maybe other crews, were put in a position where they had to dump fuel in order to make an emergency landing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not familiar with any specific instance. I have to, my instinct is to say yes.
Right.
But I don't know of I can't quote a really specific example right now. I know that it led in the aftermath. It led to some redesign, and there was some paperwork about how to make them more fireproof and how to take preventative actions, and that the subsequent design from Sikorsky, the VS-44, had a completely different fuel dumping arrangement. I had a chance to go view the one surviving example of that type of airplane is preserved at the New England Air Museum in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, and the director there, Debbie Reed, arranged with some of the museum volunteers to show me the entire plane and to walk around it. And it was just a really cool experience, because the plane is the closest analog that we have to the S-42 surviving, where the wingspan is only six feet greater, and maybe about 10 or 12 feet longer in the fuselage. But so to walk up and walk alongside of it is to know something of what it was like to be in the presence of an S-42. But I asked my tour guide to show me the dump valves, because there'd been such attention paid to them on the in the wake of the Samoan Clipper, and you know, thinking that he was going to point to, you know, some sort of outlet in the underside of the wing, and we were by the tail of the airplane, and he just said, he just pointed, and he said, "That's it." And there was a pipe, like a tailpipe, like sticking out the back of the plane. And it turns out what they had done is they had ducted all the fuel release, just funnels